In the autumn of 1777, as the leaves turned crimson across the hills of upstate New York, a small, ragged Continental army under General Horatio Gates found itself facing the full might of the British Empire in one of the most decisive campaigns of the American Revolutionary War. General John Burgoyne, a confident and theatrical British commander known as Gentleman Johnny, had marched south from Canada with a professional army of over 7,000 redcoats, Hessian mercenaries, Canadian militia, and Native American allies, dragging heavy artillery through dense wilderness with the grand plan to split the rebellious colonies in two by linking up with forces from New York City and crushing the rebellion at its heart. But by September, Burgoyne's advance had slowed to a crawl, his supply lines stretched dangerously thin across hundreds of miles of hostile territory, his men exhausted, and his native allies beginning to drift away, while the American forces, swelled by militia pouring in from New England, grew stronger by the day. At the small crossroads settlement of Saratoga, on a series of wooded heights and open fields beside the Hudson River, roughly 2,000 determined American riflemen and infantry under the brilliant leadership of Benedict Arnold, Daniel Morgan, and Enoch Poor prepared to meet the British head-on, facing an enemy force that, with reinforcements and artillery, outnumbered them nearly 8-1 in the key engagements. The fate of the American Revolution hung in the balance. If Burgoyne broke through, he could isolate New England, starve Washington's army, and potentially end the war in British favor. But if the Americans could halt him, even temporarily, it would prove that citizen soldiers could stand against the world's finest professional army and perhaps convince France to openly join the fight. As the morning mist rose on September 19, 1777, the first battle, known as Freeman's Farm, began with Daniel Morgan's elite riflemen hidden in the trees, picking off British officers with deadly accuracy from hundreds of yards, their long rifles far outranging smoothbore muskets and sowing chaos in the redcoat ranks before the main lines even closed. Burgoyne, undeterred, launched a series of disciplined bayonet charges, his men advancing in perfect formation under murderous fire, capturing some American redoubts, but at horrific cost as Arnold led ferocious counterattacks, riding fearlessly through the smoke to rally his men and throw back the British again and again. By nightfall, the field was littered with hundreds of redcoats, the British technically holding the ground, but having suffered irreplaceable losses, while the Americans withdrew in good order, their morale soaring at having bloodied the enemy so thoroughly. Burgoyne, expecting quick victory, dug in and waited for promised reinforcements that never came, his supplies dwindling and desertions rising, while the Americans fortified their lines and more militia arrived daily, turning the tables until the Americans now outnumbered the British in the field. 3 weeks later, on October 7th, Burgoyne launched a desperate reconnaissance in force with about 2,000 of his best troops toward the American left at Bemis Heights, hoping to find a way around the fortified position. But Arnold, furious at being sidelined by Gates in a command dispute, seized the moment, leaping onto his horse and charging into the fray without orders, rallying the men with cries of "Come on, boys!" as he led wave after wave against the British center. In the climax at Freeman's Farm once more, roughly 2,000 American troops under Arnold's inspired leadership smashed into the elite British grenadiers and Hessian defenders, overrunning redoubts, capturing artillery, and driving the enemy back in confusion, while Morgan's riflemen flanked from the woods and Poor's brigade hit the other side. The British lines cracked, their commanders falling one after another, and by the time Arnold was shot in the leg, his horse killed beneath him, the battle was won, with the Americans inflicting devastating casualties on a force nearly triple their size in the key assaults and forcing Burgoyne into full retreat. Surrounded now in Saratoga with no supplies and no hope of relief, Burgoyne held a council of war where his officers admitted defeat, and on October 17, 1777, he surrendered his entire army, nearly 6,000 men laying arms in one of the greatest capitulations in British military history. The news of Saratoga electrified the world. In Paris, Benjamin Franklin leveraged the victory to secure formal French alliance, bringing naval power, troops, and money that turned a regional rebellion into a global war the British could not win. Consider how those 2,000 Americans at the critical moments of Saratoga did not merely crush 15,000 British and Allied troops across the campaign in terms of momentum and morale, but delivered the turning point that saved the revolution, proved the viability of American independence, and set in motion the chain of events that would birth the United States, reminding generations that determined citizen soldiers fighting for liberty on their own soil can defeat the most powerful empire on Earth and change the course of history forever. The story of Saratoga begins long before the first shot in the ambitious British strategy cooked up in London to end the rebellion swiftly in 1777, what historians call the three-pronged plan to converge at Albany and sever New England from the rest of the colonies. General Howe in New York was supposed to march north up the Hudson, St. Leger was to come from the west via Lake Ontario, and Burgoyne would drive south from Canada with the main force, but poor coordination doomed the effort from the start, as Howe instead sailed south to capture Philadelphia, leaving Burgoyne isolated. Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne was a fascinating figure, a playwright, gambler, and politician as much as a soldier, who had convinced King George that he could win glory with a grand invasion, promising to reach Albany by autumn with an army that included not just redcoats, but brass bands, lavish baggage trains, and even his mistress, turning the campaign into a rolling spectacle that slowed his progress disastrously. The Americans, meanwhile, were led by Horatio Gates, a former British officer who had joined the patriot cause and built strong defensive works at Bemis Heights, designed by the Polish engineer Tadeusz Kościuszko, creating a naturally strong position with ravines, woods, and fields that favored the defensive riflemen over traditional line infantry. But the true fire of the American side came from Benedict Arnold, at this point still a heroic and brilliant commander whose courage and aggression had saved the day at Valcour Island and other battles, though his prickly pride and disputes with Gates would foreshadow his later tragedy. Daniel Morgan's Virginia riflemen were the elite sharpshooters of the army, frontiersmen in hunting shirts who could hit a man at 300 yards and operated in loose formation, picking off officers and artillery crews to disrupt British command before the main lines even closed. Burgoyne, undeterred, launched a series of disciplined bayonet charges, his men advancing in perfect formation under murderous fire, capturing some American redoubts, but at horrific cost as Arnold led ferocious counterattacks, riding fearlessly through the smoke to rally his men and throw back the British again and again. By nightfall, the field was littered with hundreds of redcoats, the British technically holding the ground, but having suffered irreplaceable losses, while the Americans withdrew in good order, their morale soaring at having bloodied the enemy so thoroughly. Burgoyne, expecting quick victory, dug in and waited for promised reinforcements that never came, his supplies dwindling and desertions rising, while the Americans fortified their lines and more militia arrived daily, turning the tables until the Americans now outnumbered the British in the field. 3 weeks later, on October 7th, Burgoyne launched a desperate reconnaissance in force with about 2,000 of his best troops toward the American left at Bemis Heights, hoping to find a way around the fortified position. But Arnold, furious at being sidelined by Gates in a command dispute, seized the moment, leaping onto his horse and charging into the fray without orders, rallying the men with cries of "Come on, boys," as he led wave after wave against the British center. In the climax at Freeman's farm once more, roughly 2,000 American troops under Arnold's inspired leadership smashed into the elite British grenadiers and Hessian defenders, overrunning redoubts, capturing artillery, and driving the enemy back in confusion, while Morgan's riflemen flanked from the woods and Poor's brigade hit the other side. The British lines cracked, their commanders falling one after another, and by the time Arnold was shot in the leg, his horse killed beneath him, the battle was won, with the Americans inflicting devastating casualties on a force nearly triple their size in the key assaults and forcing Burgoyne into full retreat.
Surrounded now in Saratoga with no supplies and no hope of relief, Burgoyne held a council of war where his officers admitted defeat, and on October 17, 1777, he surrendered his entire army, nearly 6,000 men laying arms, in one of the greatest capitulations in British military history. The news of Saratoga electrified the world. In Paris, Benjamin Franklin leveraged the victory to secure formal French alliance, bringing naval power, troops, and money that turned a regional rebellion into a global war the British could not win. Consider how those 2,000 Americans at the critical moments of Saratoga did not merely crush 15,000 British and Allied troops across the campaign in terms of momentum and morale, but delivered the turning point that saved the revolution, proved the viability of American independence, and set in motion the chain of events that would birth the United States, reminding generations that determined citizen soldiers fighting for liberty on their own soil can defeat the most powerful empire on Earth and change the course of history forever. The story of Saratoga begins long before the first shot in
The legacy of Saratoga extends far beyond the immediate military victory, for it fundamentally altered the nature of the Revolutionary War and set precedents that would influence American military and political thought for centuries to come, as the surrender of a British field army demonstrated to the world that the Patriots were capable of conventional battlefield success, not just guerrilla harassment, and this credibility was precisely what convinced the French monarchy, already inclined toward revenge for the 7 Years' War, to commit openly with fleets, armies, and subsidies that shifted the strategic balance irrevocably. French engineers like Duportail improved American fortifications, French artillery trained Knox's gunners to higher standards, and the French Navy under D'Estaing and later Desgrais challenged British control of the coasts, culminating in the blockade at Yorktown, where another British army surrendered 4 years later in direct consequence of the momentum begun at Saratoga. The victory also inspired other powers. Spain declared war in 1779, recapturing Florida and menacing British Caribbean possessions. The Dutch provided loans and trade, and the League of Armed Neutrality tied down British naval resources in European waters. Britain, once confident of quick suppression, now faced a global coalition and domestic war weariness, with opposition politicians like Chatham and Fox citing Saratoga as proof the war was unwinnable. Within America, the victory stabilized the currency temporarily as confidence rose, encouraged enlistments for longer terms, and gave Washington political capital to weather the Valley Forge winter and implement von Steuben's training that turned the Continental Army into a more professional force. Saratoga marked the emergence of the United States as a diplomatic entity. Franklin, Adams, and Jay negotiated from strength in Paris, securing recognition of independence and generous boundaries in the final treaty. The battle also had profound personal consequences. Arnold's heroism earned him promotion, but also deepened his resentment over slow reimbursement of expenses and perceived slights, planting seeds for his later treason at West Point. Gates's temporary fame led to his disastrous Southern command at Camden. Morgan retired to his Virginia farm a hero, but returned briefly for cowpens. The common soldiers, many of whom received land bounties in the Northwest Territory, became the first generation of Western settlers, carrying revolutionary ideals into new states. The site itself became hallowed ground. Early tourists visited in the 1790s, guidebooks described the positions, and by the centennial in 1877, massive celebrations with veterans from both sides, now reconciled, marked the surrender ground. The national park established in 1938 preserves 10 square miles of battlefield, with restored redoubts, cannon, and interpretive trails where visitors can trace Arnold's charge or stand where Fraser fell. Annual reenactments draw thousands in period dress, firing muskets and demonstrating 18th century tactics, keeping the memory vivid for new generations. Militarily, Saratoga is studied as a masterpiece of defensive strategy, how Gates and Kosciuszko used terrain to negate British advantages, how Morgan's riflemen disrupted command and control, how Arnold's aggression exploited opportunities despite personal disputes. Modern doctrines of combined arms, initiative at lower levels, and the importance of logistics all find early examples here. The battle also highlighted the militia's potential when properly integrated with regulars, influencing the Second Amendment debate and American military tradition of citizen soldiers. Globally, revolutionary movements from Latin America to Greece cited Saratoga as proof that determined peoples could overthrow imperial rule. In popular culture, novels, films, and documentaries continually retell the story. Arnold's tragic arc, Burgoyne's theatrical personality, the dramatic charges through smoke and autumn leaves. Monuments dot the park. The Boot Monument anonymously honors Arnold's wounded leg, his name omitted due to treason. The Fraser stone marks the sniper shot. The surrender site features a symbolic British cannon. Every October, ceremonies commemorate the convention, with descendants of participants sometimes attending. The victory's ripple effects shaped the Constitution itself. Fear of standing armies led to checks on military power, while the need for unified command influenced the executive article. Consider ultimately how those 2,000 Americans who carried the heaviest fighting in the decisive moments at Saratoga, through marksmanship, bayonet work, and unyielding resolve on familiar ground, effectively crushed the operational viability of a far larger British and Allied force, delivering not just a battlefield win, but the strategic turning point that secured foreign alliances, prolonged the war until Britain tired, and ensured the successful birth of a new nation founded on principles of liberty and self-government, a stand whose consequences continue to define the United States and inspire every struggle for independence, with the enduring lesson that ordinary citizens united in a just cause can defeat the mightiest professional armies when the stakes are freedom itself. The tactical intricacies of Saratoga reveal why the Americans prevailed despite inferior training and supply. The first battle on September 19th unfolded across 3 distinct phases: initial skirmishing in the woods where Morgan's riflemen ambushed British foragers, the main clash around Freeman's farm where Hamilton's British center held against repeated American assaults, and the late counterattacks led by Arnold that nearly turned British success into disaster. Burgoyne committed his troops in columns suited for European battlefields, but the wooded terrain fragmented his formations and exposed officers to sniper fire, while American forces fought in looser order from cover before closing with bayonets. The British captured the field but lost 3 times as many men, a ratio they could not sustain far from home. During the interlude, American engineers strengthened Bemis Heights into one of the strongest defensive positions of the war, with flèches, abattis, and artillery sighted to enfilade attackers. Burgoyne's October 7th probe was meant to reconnoiter the American left, but became a general engagement when American skirmishers engaged aggressively, drawing in reserves. The fighting centered on 3 key points: the attack on Balcarres Redoubt, where British grenadiers repulsed initial assaults with disciplined volleys, the flanking movement by Poor and Learned that threatened the British right, and the decisive storming of Breymann's Redoubt, where Arnold's personal leadership and the momentum from earlier gains overwhelmed the Hessian defenders. The capture of those positions unhinged Burgoyne's line and exposed his camp, making continued resistance impossible. The pursuit to Saratoga village was merciless, American militia swarming the roads, capturing stragglers, and cutting off retreat until the British were trapped against the Hudson with flooded meadows behind them. Burgoyne's final council of war on October 13th admitted defeat, and negotiations produced the Convention of Saratoga. Technically not a surrender, but an agreement to lay down arms and return to Britain on parole, though political wrangling kept most troops in America. The convention troops marched south under guard, many escaping along the way or settling after the war. The captured equipment, over 5,000 muskets, 42 cannon, ammunition wagons, directly strengthened the Continental Army. The psychological impact was immense. British prestige suffered a blow from which it never fully recovered in the war, while American confidence soared. Washington wrote that Saratoga must have the happiest effect on our affairs in Europe. Indeed, when the news arrived in France, Louis XVI approved open alliance, and Vergennes instructed diplomats to conclude treaties. The French fleet's arrival in 1778 forced Britain to evacuate Philadelphia and shift to southern strategy, stretching resources further. Saratoga thus initiated the chain reaction that led to Yorktown and peace in 1883. Saratoga also marked the decline of Native American support for Britain, as tribes saw the invasion falter and made separate peaces.
Women played crucial roles. Camp followers nursed wounded, cooked, and sometimes fought. Local families hid deserters or guided scouts. The African-American presence, hundreds fought on both sides, many seeking freedom, highlighted the contradiction of a revolution for liberty that tolerated slavery. Saratoga's legacy includes the ongoing debate over Arnold, hero of the battle yet traitor later, his name erased from monuments yet his courage undeniable. Modern historians rank Saratoga among the most decisive battles in world history, comparable to Marathon or Waterloo for its strategic consequences. The visitor center features artifacts, musket balls, buttons, cannonballs, dug from the fields, connecting visitors tangibly to the events. Educational programs teach school groups about 18th century life and tactics. Consider how those 2,000 Americans in the chaos of smoke, noise, and autumn mud did not merely win 2 battles, but crushed the British northern strategy, captured an army, secured the alliances that won the war, and established the precedent that a democratic people in arms could defeat their freedom against professional oppression, a victory whose consequences continue to unfold in every generation that studies the birth of the United States and draws inspiration from ordinary citizens who achieved the extraordinary when everything depended on their stand in those fateful fields of Saratoga.
The story of Saratoga is also one of missed opportunities and what-ifs that could have changed history dramatically. For had General Howe marched north from New York as originally planned, instead of detouring to Philadelphia, Burgoyne might have been reinforced and the invasion succeeded. Had Clinton's diversion up the Hudson been more aggressive, capturing the American forts and opening the river, supplies could have reached the Northern Army. Had Burgoyne moved faster in the summer or abandoned his heavy baggage, he might have reached Albany before American forces concentrated. Yet each of these possibilities failed due to poor coordination in London, overconfidence in British command, and the fierce American resistance that turned every delay into disaster. Burgoyne's personality played no small role. He was a gentleman soldier who believed in chivalry and spectacle, bringing silver plate, champagne, and even a full orchestra that slowed his columns to a crawl through the wilderness, while his orders to native allies to terrorize the frontier backfired spectacularly, with incidents like the death of Jane McCree rallying thousands of militia who might otherwise have stayed home. Gates, for his part, was a cautious commander who preferred entrenchment to risk, yet his steadiness allowed the army to grow while Burgoyne shrank, and his willingness to accept Arnold's defiance in the second battle, however grudgingly, saved the day. The role of foreign-born officers was crucial. Polish engineer Kościuszko's fortifications were masterpieces that maximized American advantages. German-born von Steuben would soon drill the army at Valley Forge, using lessons from Saratoga. Baron de Kalb and others brought European expertise. The battle highlighted the evolving nature of warfare in America, traditional European linear tactics clashing with frontier skirmishing and defensive works, a hybrid style that would characterize American fighting from the Revolution through the Civil War and beyond. The surrender's aftermath saw the convention troops march through New England towns, where crowds jeered but also offered food, humanizing the enemy and sowing seeds of reconciliation. Many British and German soldiers deserted during the long captivity, marrying local women and settling in Pennsylvania or Virginia, their descendants today part of the American fabric. Burgoyne returned to England facing criticism but defended himself in Parliament and wrote plays satirizing the ministry's mismanagement. Gates received a Congressional Gold Medal, but his later defeat at Camden ended his military career. Arnold's wound left him lame and embittered, his financial grievances and pride leading to the darkest betrayal in American history when he tried to sell West Point in 1780, a tragedy that began with his greatest glory at Saratoga. Morgan retired a legend, his rifle corps disbanded, but its tactics influencing future units like the Kentucky Riflemen at New Orleans. The battle's anniversaries have been celebrated since the 1820s, with the 50th in 1827 drawing surviving veterans and speeches by Lafayette during his American tour. The centennial in 1877 featured massive gatherings and the dedication of monuments funded by public subscription. During the Civil War, both Union and Confederate leaders studied Saratoga for lessons in maneuver and morale. In World War II, American officers carried accounts of the battle as inspiration for citizen armies defeating professionals.
Today, the Saratoga National Historical Park welcomes hundreds of thousands annually, with living history demonstrations, cannon firings, and guided tours that bring the events vividly to life. The park's museum displays artifacts like Burgoyne's camp chest, Morgan's rifle barrel fragments, and soldiers' letters home describing the fear and exhilaration of battle. Educational programs reach schools nationwide, teaching not just military history but the broader story of how ordinary people achieved independence through perseverance. The battle's name lives on in place names across America: Saratoga counties, towns, springs, and even the famous racetrack whose mineral waters were discovered by Revolutionary veterans. The victory is commemorated in art. Paintings by John Trumbull and Alonzo Chappell depict Arnold's charge and the surrender. Statues of key figures stand in the Capitol and state houses. Popular books and documentaries continually revisit the campaign, exploring the personalities and contingencies that made Saratoga the turning point it was. Modern scholarship debates exact numbers. Burgoyne had about 7,200 effectives by October, the Americans perhaps 12,000 to 15,000 total, but only a portion engaged at once. Yet the outcome remains clear. A smaller, motivated force using terrain and initiative defeated a larger professional army through attrition and decisive strikes. The battle exemplifies Clausewitz's principles of friction and the moral forces in war long before he wrote them down. It also raises enduring questions about loyalty, ambition, and the cost of freedom. Arnold's fall from hero to traitor, perhaps the most poignant example. Consider anew how those 2,000 Americans who fought in the hottest actions at Saratoga with rifles, bayonets, and raw determination amid the autumn forests and fields did not simply defeat 15,000 British and Allied troops across the campaign, but shattered an imperial strategy, captured an army, secured the alliances that won independence, and established forever the power of a free people to defend their liberty against any odds. A victory whose light continues to guide every generation that cherishes the ideals born in the fire and sacrifice of those decisive days beside the Hudson in 1777, proving that when citizens stand united for a just cause, they can crush the mightiest empires and forge nations that endure.